Hey, Lobbert here with another discussion video. I enjoyed ranking fogs last time and wanted to rank mana rocks this time. Before we get into that, I want to let patrons know that I changed my mind. I said in the last video that I won't charge for discussion videos, but after this one, I'm going to charge if I make one. I think they add a lot of value to the channel. If you're enjoying what I do here, please consider liking this video, subscribing for more Pauper Commander content, and becoming a patron to encourage me to keep making content like this. I also wanted to spotlight a couple comments from my last video. Mizu-sun4431 says, I think that Haze of Pollen and the other cycler should be rated a bit more highly. Being a combat fog when needed, or a cycler when not, is utility that some of the other effects don't have. I knew that some people were going to disagree with my assessment of cyclers. F tier may be a bit too harsh. I don't rate cycling as being a very powerful effect, but if your evaluation is better, it might deserve a higher ranking. And JohnGrind7123 says, I think Tangle is better than rated, which was D tier. It can also be an opening to get more damage on a player that has a dominant board state. People sometimes can't afford to attack into someone if they will be dead on the crackback, but if they are tapped for a turn, everyone can pile on. Even if that main threat person isn't taken out, now they can be less focused on you. That is true, leaving them open is pretty appealing. If your opponents have someone to attack, they're less likely to attack you. I'm still not excited about playing it, but these other perspectives are very welcome here. Now for the main topic, ranking mana rocks. I'm going to define mana rocks as an artifact spell that produces mana, and I'm going to exclude ones that filter mana such as Prophetic Prism. I think a lot of people come to Pauper Commander from PDH, so they'll know how important mana rocks can be. I think they're a little less important in Pauper Commander because the spells in the format are less impactful on average, and we, of course, don't have access to free ones like Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, or Moxen. But the format being slower allows you to play higher mana value rocks that each offer additional utility. S tier. These end up in almost every list I make. There are exceptions, but they are rare. Bonder's Ornament. 3 mana is too much to earn a slot in any of my commander decks, but in Pauper Commander, I put this card in almost everything. Bonder's Ornament fixes your mana, which you'll see in these rankings that I value very highly. It also has an ability for 4 mana that allows each person that controls a Bonder's Ornament to draw a card. This can repeatedly draw you a card every turn cycle at instant speed, and help you grind your opponents down with card advantage. The ability allowing other ornament controllers to draw is actually a plus in my experience. The players that control the ornaments just quickly outpace those without them, so I'd rather be part of the Ornament Club. Honored Heirloom is another 3 mana rock that adds 1 mana of any color with an ability. Its ability only costs 2, so it's easy to leave open while having the option to use the mana for something else like protection or interaction. It's also one of the only sources of repeatable graveyard hate in Pauper Commander. It may surprise a lot of 60-card Pauper players, but Relic of Progenitus isn't played that often. The fact that the first ability of Relic can't snipe what you want means it's pretty useless with 3 times the number of cards in opponents' graveyards, so either you save the Relic by not popping it, or, what happens more frequently, you sacrifice it immediately to draw a card to be more proactive, leaving you without graveyard hate when it matters. Honored Heirloom lets you have your cake and eat it too. It might even be the best piece of graveyard hate in the format. Let me know in the comments if you think that's untrue. Our last S tier card is Arcane Signet. 2 mana rocks are very powerful because if they enter the battlefield untapped, they refund a mana because they can be used immediately. Arcane Signet stands out among them by simply always making the color you need it to, which means that if it's the last spell you cast on your turn, you can leave up a 1 mana spell. A tier. I strongly consider these based on meta and my deck's synergies, strengths, and weaknesses. For example, if you have a 4 mana commander, playing 3 mana rocks won't actually accelerate you into your commander, so consider favoring 2 mana rocks, so if you have one on turn 2, you can play your commander on turn 3, which makes a big difference. Belware Stone does a pretty good impression of Arcane Signet, but it's not quite as consistent. The games where your opponents don't have the colors you need don't line up with the games where you absolutely need the mana to be colored very often, so its downside is negligible. Magnifying Glass is pretty much a worse Bonder's Ornament, but despite only producing colorless mana, and costing an extra 2 mana to sacrifice the clue, the ability to repeatedly draw cards at instant speed is enticing enough for long games that this still earns an A ranking. Everflowing Chalice only produces colorless mana, but its ability to scale is a relevant option that will be better or worse depending on how mana hungry your deck is. If you consistently have lots of cards in your hand but can't pay for them, or you need to keep replaying your commander, 1 card producing 2 mana is how you do more with less. The rate isn't fantastic, but playing it for 4 and having 1 spare colored mana to play something that costs 3 or less lets you maintain your tempo some. Unstable Obelisk is often a necessary evil. It's mostly earned its slot because I spent too long thinking about the question, What if my opponent plays Oubliette on my commander? But really, having a generic answer late game shores up your deck's weaknesses, and while you're making your way to the late game, this is going to help with mana generation. Network Terminal. Our last card in A tier is yet another 3-mana rock that can produce any color and has a repeatable ability. The mana cost for activating its ability is low, which means our primary concern is if we'll have an untapped artifact. It's surprisingly easy to change a couple of lands into artifacts, or have another rock or equipment that you were running anyway enable this. Another thing to consider is if you'll have cards that we want to get rid of. Even if you're not drawing huge amounts of cards, the card is worded to draw a card before discarding, which means you'll never make your hand worse. It's also nice that many cards in your deck may have incidental graveyard synergies, such as cards with flashback. B tier. I run these when they have a synergy with my deck, or when they shore up one of my weaknesses, which isn't uncommon. Lantern of Revealing is another source of repeatable card advantage, but it's a little too inconsistent for my taste. An average deck is only going to hit about 1 out of every 3 activations. It gets better with deck manipulations such as Scry, but most of the cards I run with Scry on them immediately draw those cards afterward. It just doesn't hold up to the other 3-mana rocks in most cases, but you could just run all of them. Thought Vessel. In other formats, I definitely subscribe to the idea that you should be able to win the game with a 7-card hand, because even if you have to discard a couple, you still keep the best ones, which are usually enough to win. In Pauper Commander, where the spells are less impactful, I find myself able to burn through a 7-card hand with a lot of game left ahead of me, so I found that decks that get a lot of cards in their hand actually want Thought Vessel. Pristine Talisman. The turn you play this almost always feels awkward. It doesn't produce colored mana, so being net -2 mana can really be bad tempo, where the card shines is in long games. Requiring no additional investment for the steady stream of life really adds up. Life gain is a really strong effect in a format where life totals start at 30, and combat is very important. This might even be the best source of life gain in red and blue. Mindstone. I think putting this in B tier will be a little controversial. I'd love to hear counter-arguments in the comments. Mindstone is good because it's flexible. It accelerates you early, and sacrificing it to draw a card can give you something later in the game to do when you run out, but I count on my commander being removed many times in a game, and build my decks to play a steady stream of cards, and even have mana sinks like the ability rocks I mentioned earlier. I would rather keep my mana sources in play, and get a different kind of advantage out of my 2-mana rock slot. Springleaf Drum only costs 1, and produces colored mana, but it has the drawback of requiring you to tap a creature. A lot of decks find it difficult to spare the potential blocker, but being 1 mana allows it to refund its own cost if you have the creature to spare on the turn it comes out. A common scenario is that I'd like to be proactive and play a creature, but I may be forced to wait so I can keep up mana for a protection spell or need to hold up a removal spell. Having Springleaf Drum sometimes means that I'm able to play the creature and pass with an untapped creature for blocking and still have access to some mana. Decks with high creature counts or creatures that never block may want to consider this. Prismatic Lens is another option if you're in the market for a 2-mana rock. Using the second ability never feels good, but it does add consistency. They say it's better to have it and not need it, than need it and not have it. At this point, you're probably adding this to your deck if you've already added most of the other 2-mana rocks to your deck. The Signet Cycle. Ranking this low bucks the trend of me really valuing producing colored mana. The way that they add it can just be very awkward. If you need to play a spell that costs 2 mana of the same color, such as Grasp of Darkness, this gets really awkward. If you have a Signet and 1 untapped swamp, you're unable to cast it. If you have 2 untapped swamps, you'll just use those and won't have the mana to activate this. So in a few situations, the Signets fall short of rocks that actually produce colored mana. All that being said though, on later turns if you prioritize using these first to avoid awkward mana situations, they can work fine for fixing your mana. Sisay's Ring and Urgolem's Eye are less good Everflowing Chalices, but the logic that makes Everflowing Chalice good also works on these. Producing 2 mana for the investment of a single card is very powerful in some mana-hungry decks. C tier. At this point and below, I would say that you're going deep on mana rocks. It's uncommon to do this, but I'd still say it's reasonable, and I wouldn't fault anyone for running these. Fractured Power Stone's second ability is useless, but it's the final 2-mana rock that comes in untapped, which means it's perfect for my C tier. If you want to max out on untapped 2-mana rocks, it's here if you need it. Seer's Lantern suffers from both costing 3 and producing colorless mana. We were able to overlook that somewhat on Magnifying Glass, Unstable Obelisk, and to some degree Pristine Talisman, but even with the low cost of 2 to activate, I find myself cutting the card more often than not. The Diamond Cycle is our first enters the battlefield tapped rocks. They have the advantage that they can be played on turn 2, but on later turns, in terms of net mana cost, they are the same as an untapped 3-mana rock, which we can usually find some additional advantage on. If you really prioritize both colored mana and having 4 mana on turn 3, you may be able to find use for these. Decanter of Endless Water tries to make up for being a worse Thought Vessel by producing colored mana, but we all know it's just Thought Vessel number 2. Commander's Sphere. For the same reason I gave Mind Vessel a lower ranking, I'm still not excited about sacrificing my mana sources, but comparing this to Mind Vessel, both of these cards at some point will be in your hand, and you'll want to play them and immediately sacrifice them. Since Commander Sphere's second ability doesn't require you to tap it, you at least get 1 mana refunded. It's also colored mana. All of this together is still not enough to make up for costing 3 in my opinion. Fountain of Ichor and Guardian Idol. The drawback for these is that Fountain of Ichor costs 3 mana and Guardian Idol enters tapped, which makes them subpar mana rocks, but they're actually not bad creatures. Having a colorless creature can come in handy when someone is trying to make a creature unblockable by giving it protection, and just having a creature can come in handy when someone plays an edict effect, like Fleshbag Marauder. Not to mention dodging board wipes like Pestilence and all the other wonderful things creatures do, like taking and holding the initiative, or just attacking, but making them a creature frequently results in them dying, which is hard to justify a lot of the time. D tier. I avoid funding these if I can, but in rare cases, I begrudgingly include them in my deck. Orazca Relic. The City's Blessing is easy enough to achieve, but the 3 life doesn't make up for the inferior mana producing abilities when compared to Mind Stone and Command Sphere in my opinion. The one-time life gain also doesn't really stack up to Pristine Talisman that lets you keep the mana source and gain the life. Lotus Petal. With how I defined mana rocks, Lotus Petal makes the list. This card is powerful in EDH with their powerful spells, but what I've seen in Pauper Commander is your threats get removed and you're just behind everyone else. Star Compass combines the negatives of having a tapped mana source like the diamonds, with not actually fixing your mana. It does have the benefit, though, of being more flexible than the diamonds if you have lands that produce more than 1 color of mana. The Locket Cycle and Infernal Idol. This might be another controversial ranking. People love to draw 2 cards. The Locket's abilities are very colored mana intensive though. Wanting to activate these will really highlight how many colorless sources you have, and 7 mana is a large investment to extract your card advantage from it. Infernal Idol isn't part of the same cycle, but it also costs 3 mana, and its ability draws 2 cards. The difference is that it can be run in a mono black deck, it doesn't fix your mana as nicely, and the activation of its draw 2 ability is different, costing 1 less mana and allowing 1 generic mana make a huge difference in making this easier to activate. 2 life hurts a little, but in the right deck, that's negligible. As with the other rocks that sacrifice themselves, I rank these poorly because I question just how much mana it will generate before we sacrifice it for cards. If it's out for 4 turns, before you sacrifice it, Infernal Idol will have generated 4 mana and will be untapped. If you sacrifice it that turn, the card has been a net loss of 2 mana and 2 life, with the tempo loss being front-loaded, which is when it hurts the most, all for an additional card. All that being said, if you plan on keeping them for a while or plan to have enough mana to activate them easily, they can be the correct pick for your deck. F tier. There are rarely, if any, synergies with these cards that make them worth it. I would reconsider running these unless you're sure that's what you're going for. Mana producing creatures. Ornithopter of Paradise, Mirror, Mannequin, Bronze Walrus, Opaline Unicorn, Scuttlemutt, Tower Worker. I'm sure there's others. As much as I hate losing a mana source because I want to draw a card, I hate losing my creature to removal more, which is exactly what these open you up to. Even efficient cards like Elvish Mystic don't see play for the same reason. While Pauper Commander's board wipes don't look like other formats, they do exist. Pestilence, Crypt Rats, Fiery Cannonade, and many others incidentally putting you turns behind just isn't worth the risk. Ashnod's Altar is another card like Lotus Petal that makes the list by a technicality. I say that because it really does make a terrible mana rock. Sacrificing a creature is not worth 2 mana in this format, unless you're doing it to win the game, which this sometimes can do. I'd say this is a great combo piece, but it won't accelerate you very well. The Banner and Cluestone cycle as well as Letter of Acceptance only draw 1 card, so they're competing directly with Commander Sphere, and losing badly. The Orb of Dragonkind cycle. These are actually kind of powerful, there just aren't very many dragons in the format. Sphere of the Suns. The center's tapped and has limited activations. I don't like it. Darksteel Ingot is only good if you're going to animate it, which is very rare. Indestructible creatures are actually strong in the format though. Mana Geode. Scry 1 is nothing. Hierophant's Chalice. 1 life is nothing. At least Mana Geode made mana of any color. Vessel of Endless Rest. Sorcery Speed Graveyard Hate for 1 card is nothing. Inherited Envelope is underwhelming. Phyrexian Atlas is not even good in a poison deck. Spectral Searchlight, I'm sure someone loves this, but it's not me. Meteorite, I have a soft spot for Meteorite, but 5 mana is just too much at the end of the day. Ticket Turbo Tubes, tickets can actually be really strong, but unless you find your cards that allow you to spend them, it's just a 3 mana rock. Powerstone Shard, maybe you can copy it, but that's like one deck. Altar of the Pantheon, Manolith, and the Obelisks are 3 mana rocks with really no upside. And last, we have the Border Post cycle. Unlike every other 3 mana rock, these always enter tapped. Playing them normally costs 2 colored pips, which is 2 more than everything else on the list. But what about their ability? It only works if you have a basic land, and it still costs 1 mana, so it's not only a net loss of mana on the turn it comes out, it doesn't even accelerate you. Avoid playing these if possible. If I missed anything or you think I rated these incorrectly, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching until the end. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Check the playlists on this channel for more videos like this.